Hello, I am Ashley Chesser with Wild Farm Alliance. Thanks for joining us today for Avian Ecosystem Services in Vineyards. Since the year 2000, Wild Farm Alliance has been working with farmers to achieve healthy, viable agriculture that protects and restores wild nature. So, this is our 25th anniversary. This webinar is part of our Farmland Flyways program, where we aim to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms by 2050. In our other program areas, we're working to see hedgerows of habitat to the moon and back, which is 500,000 miles in our Farmland Wildways program. And we're hoping to see 10% of river frontage on farms planted as farmland waterways, leading to 100,000 miles of riverine habitat. This fall, we released a new publication on protecting birds in agricultural landscapes. We want to make sure that if growers attract birds, they are providing a safe place for them to perform their ecosystem services. So this publication highlights ways farmers can reduce risk to birds while maintaining productive working lands. Right. We are offering one CE credit through California Department of Pesticide Regulation and one CCA credit from the American Society of Agronomy. So to receive that credit, please have your license number handy and enter it at the evaluation at the end. We also have two on-demand avian CE courses running right now through DPR. So if you haven't taken those and are interested, you can check those out on our website. And I'll have someone put the link in the chat there if you want to take one of those on-demand courses. Today, we have Dr. Matt Johnson and grad student Eleanor MacDonald, both of Cal Poly Humboldt, sharing their fascinating research on western bluebirds, tree swallows, and barn owls. We've been collaborating with Matt and his students for about 5 years now. They've joined field days. We're working on a video about their research and some other things coming up next year. So stay tuned for those. And that's all I've got for now. So I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Eleanor so she can kick us off.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Ashley. Gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so hopefully everybody's able to see that. All right. Hi. So, as Ashley had said, my name is Eleanor, and I'm a grad student at Cal Poly Humboldt in the Johnson Habitat Ecology Lab. And I'm really excited to be talking with you all today about insectivorous birds and their interactions with insects in vineyard ecosystems. And in particular, I'll be talking about how nest boxes influence these interactions. Okay, so as many of you may know, but if you don't, bird and insect populations are declining globally, and largely this is in part due to habitat loss as well as agricultural intensification. But at the same time, we know that insect-eating birds consume just huge numbers of arthropods in croplands every year and can really provide a valuable biological control service to growers. And specifically in California vineyards, research has found that vineyard blocks with more western bluebirds also had fewer plant-eating insects on their vines. And so together, this kind of points to this potential win-win situation when farmers support birds and growers can help conserve biodiversity. They may also potentially receive help with pest control, which has led many wine grape growers to ask the question as to how they can bring these birds to their farms. And so that brings us to the use of nest boxes and the focus of what I'll be talking about today, which is how they can be used as a tool to attract both tree swallows and western bluebirds, which are secondary cavity nesting birds, which essentially means that they're species that use existing holes in trees, but they also readily take two nest boxes. And so both of these birds forage on insects and feed them to their chicks during the breeding season. So really what we wanted to know is if we install these nest boxes in the vineyards, will the birds come in just 1 year? And then how, in turn, might this be influenced by the surrounding habitat? And then, if they do show up in response to the presence of these nest boxes, how might this affect both the pests that damage vines and cause disease, like the blue-green sharpshooter, as well as beneficial insects like green lacewings that help control those pests? So, essentially, what we're asking is, do these nest boxes and their presence have a measurable top-down effect on the insect community, and how do these effects vary with habitat at multiple scales? And so, to test this in 2023, we surveyed 20 vineyards for both birds and insects in the beautiful wine grape growing region of Napa Valley, California. So, 10 of those vineyards had existing nest boxes and 10 did not. And then in 2024, before the songbird breeding season, we added nest boxes to the 10 vineyards that previously did not have them and surveyed them all again. And so, really, what this design allows us to do is to compare the effects of adding nest boxes on both bird activity and insects before and after their installation. And so here's what one of our sites looks like, along with our sites across the valley. We had point counts, which are bird surveys spread across each vineyard, with each vineyard also containing this smaller 3 hectare nest box plot where the insect traps were placed and the boxes were placed. And so for the vineyards that we selected, they varied really in both local and landscape habitat heterogeneity or diversity, and were all either certified organic or followed organic practices with no insecticide use. And to give you a kind of a better idea as to what our surveys actually looked like, here we have the layout of the treatment versus control sites, with those control sites having pre-existing nest boxes. And so we would expect to see swallows and bluebirds at those sites in response to those nest boxes being there at the sites that had pre-existing boxes. But we would also maybe expect to see that the sites without nest boxes could potentially have some bluebirds and swallows, but likely not nearly as many as the sites with those pre-existing boxes. And so, like I had said, we had surveyed the birds during that first year, and that was during the songbird breeding season, which is from April to July. This was in 2023. And then we also used yellow sticky cards to trap the insects in the plots where those boxes were installed. And then before our 2024 surveys, we added those songbird nest boxes to the treatment sites and repeated surveys, and with the idea that those nest boxes would then increase the number of bluebirds and swallows to numbers similar to those sites with the existing nest boxes. And so here you can see one of those sticky cards. We monitored 7 pests and 7 key beneficials that are common in Napa vineyards. And then we have Autumn Turner pictured here in the center that conducted all of the bird surveys. And then in addition to that, we also took surrounding habitat measurements. So we measured cover crop phenology and diversity and quantified the local and landscape habitat variables at each site using a GIS. And so, in addition to all of that, to figure out what these birds are actually eating, we also collected fecal samples from both the nestlings and the adults that were nesting in boxes within the vineyards. And then, working with our collaborators at UC Riverside, we've been using DNA barcoding to see if vineyard pests are actually showing up in their diet. And so, we've quantified the pests from the diet and are still working on the beneficials, so there will be more to come on that as well. And so our response variables are pretty straightforward. We have our counts of tree swallows and western bluebirds from the bird surveys, as well as our counts of beneficial and pest insects. We then have our nest box effect, which is simply just the interaction between treatment and control and year to detect changes after adding those nest boxes. And then finally, we have our habitat variables that could potentially mediate the nest box effect, which included those land cover variables, so cover crop diversity and habitat diversity at both local and landscape scales. And so these all went into some statistical models essentially to test different combinations of our predictors to see which factors are best explaining variation in both bird and insect abundance. So what did we find? So as for our survey efforts across the 20 vineyards that we worked with, Autumn conducted 894 point counts and recorded 1,119 tree swallows and 909 bluebirds. And then we captured and identified over 5,000 of those 7 pest insects and over 3,900 of those beneficial arthropods. And so we detected all of the pests and beneficial taxa that we would expect to see in Napa vineyards. And for our purposes, we combined them into broader pest and beneficial categories. But to give you an idea as to what we were actually surveying for, we were looking at blue-green sharpshooters, three-cornered alfalfa hoppers, vine mealybugs, so vectors of disease in wine grape vineyards, as well as other pests, so other leafhoppers and potential vectors. And then we also looked at beneficial insects, so parasitoids of those pest insects, but also predators as well. Okay, so back to our question of did adding boxes attract the birds? So simply put, yes, the Western bluebirds at the sites where those nest boxes were added rose to a similar abundance as the sites where they had pre-existing nest boxes. We saw that tree swallows also increased, but their numbers were still lower overall um, or across the vineyard in terms of their abundance at impact sites. However, when we took a closer look to see if they increased in abundance in proximity to where we added those nest boxes, we did find that they were more responsive and increased to the abundance of that of the previously existing nest box vineyards. And so basically showed that proximity to those boxes themselves mattered. And so again, just to note in our top models that our tree swallows, we saw that significant positive effect for installing boxes that declined as the surveys were further from those nest box plots. But for those Western bluebirds, abundance was higher across the entire vineyard. And then did this then have an effect on the arthropod or insect community? So across all of our sites, we actually did not find any treatment effect of adding nest boxes on the beneficial insects, regardless of habitat context, although the beneficials did significantly increase in abundance at both those sites with nest boxes and without nest boxes in 2024. So there was an effective year. But we did find something interesting going on with our model for the pests that showed essentially a significant effect of adding those nest boxes that depended on proximity to riparian areas. So here we can see that pests actually dropped most in abundance at sites where nest boxes were added when they were located farther from riparian areas, whereas they stayed relatively steady in 2024 on control sites. So this suggests that potentially there's this benefit of nest boxes farther away from riparian areas. And so far it looks like adding boxes might reduce pests away from these riparian areas without hurting the beneficial insects. However, this still left this big question of, are these birds actually eating pests that growers care about and the pests that we were tracking on those carts? And so, fortunately, we did find that yes, they are indeed eating the pests in the vineyards. And not only are they eating the pests, but they are also feeding them to their nestlings. And so, we found that all of the pests were present in both tree swallow and bluebird diet. So, what does this all mean? So, there's a lot going on, right? So, our study shows that adding nest boxes can increase bluebird and swallow abundance in just 1 year. And in some cases, this coincided with fewer pests farther away from riparian areas, without any measurable reduction in beneficial insect populations. We also have the DNA evidence that does confirm that they are eating these vineyard pests, but we also suspect that they're more than likely eating a mix of beneficials as well, although we didn't detect measurable effect on their abundance, which ultimately complicates the net outcome that growers might see, and these relationships are complex. So it's important to also note that we only monitored these populations during the songbird breeding season, so our surveys were only from April to July, and that other ecological factors are also likely influencing pest and beneficial dynamics. Okay, and then as far as ecological explanations, there's quite a few ecological explanations for the patterns that we saw. And we observed that stronger reduction in pests farther away from riparian habitat. So this potentially reflects the habitat selection of the focal species that we're looking at. So some stuff that our collaborators at UC Davis have found in vineyards is that tree swallows preferentially hunt in open habitats, such as over vineyard rows and away from these wooded habitats, and western bluebirds also generally favor vineyard interior. So using those riparian edges more frequently during hot conditions. And so essentially installing nest boxes may have amplified bird foraging activity, especially in vineyard interiors, leading to that pest reduction at those interior sticky card trap locations. And so another complementary explanation is that riparian habitats also provide alternative and often more profitable prey, such as large protein-rich arthropods. And so in this case, birds foraging along riparian edges may also allocate effort to non-pest prey. And then finally, many of the pest densities peak in July and August for these crops, which likely influences where the pest suppression happens, but we only have survey data that goes through July, so it'd be great to have more sampling efforts and research that extends past the songbird breeding season. Okay, so bringing this back to a management perspective, so nest boxes really can be an affordable and flexible way to attract insectivorous birds, and they also provide essential nesting habitat where natural cavities are really often very limited. And so we're seeing enough evidence to suggest potential pest control benefits, which is really promising. But again, these interactions are complex, and we could really benefit from more research to understand the long-term impacts of nest boxes for both birds, insects, and growers. And then I also want to lastly mention that if you are interested in attracting these birds to your farm, we conducted a valley-wide nest box study where Brianna Martinico and some other of our colleagues found some interesting things about what might attract birds to the boxes themselves. So first, we found that they prefer boxes with predator guards. They also prefer boxes on freestanding poles rather than attached to trees or within the vineyards. So ideally placed along those vineyard edges instead of within the vineyard rows. And then we also suggest facing the entrance north or northeast to avoid overheating in the afternoon sun and to keep those boxes around or at least 25 meters from wooded areas. And so there seems to be somewhat of a trade-off between being close to wooded areas and being not so close to wooded areas. So yeah, they still prefer to have some natural habitat, but not for the nest boxes essentially to be too close, we think potentially due to potential predators. And then in terms of cost, so these are a relatively low cost way to manage pests, and especially in relation to many other pest management tools. So the boxes that we used ran about $22 each. I've seen them a little cheaper. So I've seen them anywhere from like $16 to $22. And the pole and hardware added, roughly $7. So if you're looking around $38 per installed box, and based on our boxes, we recommend a density of around 6 to 8 boxes per hectare, or about 2 to 3 boxes per acre, which works out to roughly $70 to $94 per acre up front. And then in terms of maintenance, it's pretty minimal. So usually just one clean out per year after the songbird breeding season is over, plus an occasional check to make sure you don't have invasive species such as house sparrows utilizing those boxes. And so for a relatively modest investment and light keep up, you can potentially make your vineyard much more attractive to swallows and bluebirds and potentially get a bit of extra help with insect control at the same time. And so I want to acknowledge our producer partners, the vineyard managers and owners that we worked with are fabulous. And I would like to also thank our wonderful university collaborators. This has really been a large team effort. And of course, thank you to the Wild Farm Alliance for having us and for being wonderful partners to work with, and to the Agricultural Research Institute for funding this research. Of course, thank you to the birds and the bugs, and also all of the students and technicians from both the Johnson and Carp labs. Really appreciate everybody's help on this project. And thank you. And with that, if you'd like to contact me, here's my information. I can also put it in the chat. I have my university email and then also our Songbird project email if you're interested in contacting me. Thank you so much.
I love seeing information about impact in relation to the riparian areas. That's really new information, so that's exciting to see.
Looks like there are a couple of questions in the chat. One about where to buy the boxes, and then another about competition. Maybe while I get started with the owl presentation, Eleanor, if you want to offer a couple responses in the chat there.
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right. Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks so much, Ashley, for that introduction. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks, Wild Farm Alliance, for hosting this. I'm going to be talking about barn owls. So let me get my slides going. Somebody give me a thumbs up. You see the slides? All right, great. So yeah, my team and I have been studying barn owl nest boxes in wine grape vineyards for a number of years now, and we've learned a lot of things. So what I'm going to try to do today is summarize some of what we've learned, and specifically to give you some concrete recommendations. And then time permitting and with some questions, maybe we can talk about next steps and what we should be looking for in the future. I want to certainly acknowledge all the folks that have worked on this project. So lots of graduate students, lots of undergraduate helpers, and then as Eleanor also mentioned, we've been collaborating with some other professors and scientists, especially at UC Davis, UC Riverside, and most recently Cal Poly SLO, San Luis Obispo, and the Lodi Wine Commission. So big thanks to all of them. And then once again, big thanks to Wild Farm Alliance. We work with them a lot on these dissemination events, and it's really important for us to try to get our applied research into the hands of people who can use it. So I'll just briefly go over a little background on history of barn owls for pest control, talk about our previous and current work, and try to include some specific recommendations. So this is a really old idea. Way back in the late 1800s, it was acknowledged by scientists that barn owls could potentially help control rodent pests, as this publication from 1893 suggests. But it really didn't get a lot of rigorous scientific research. There was a number of publications in the late 1990s, early 2000s, they all suggest that these barn owls might really help control pests, but nobody had really tested it very carefully. And so that's what my team has been doing. We've been studying barn owl nest boxes for 10 years now, 11 actually, and we monitor them with a little GoPro on an extendable pole like you see here. So there we do that during the day while the owls are sleeping. There's a male and a female with their eggs. Just like the bluebirds and swallows that Eleanor talked about, these are obligate secondary cavity nesting birds, meaning they need a cavity, some kind of hole to nest in, but they can't make it themselves. So if you build a nest box, you can attract these owls to your farms. And we've learned that we've monitored hundreds of owl boxes in a variety of places, And the occupancy rate is somewhere between 20 to 75%, depending on the year and the place. And we've learned a lot about what kinds of boxes they like the best. And so we have some good information on our website. Here's a QR code to some of that detail. This is also on Wild Farm Alliance's webpage. In short, the birds like boxes that are wooden and that are fairly tall and that have some natural open habitat nearby, especially grasslands. And so that's how we can make some of our very first recommendations. So install them on a metal pole. It's best if those boxes have some grooves in them, so the owls can get a better grip with an appropriately sized opening. We do recommend this partition wall, like a partial wall on the inside of the box here, that not only protects the nestlings from inclement weather, but also can keep curious and hungry raccoons from being able to reach their arm in there and grab them. It's best to have the hole, entrance hole, up closer to the top of the nest box so the chicks don't fall out, and also to mitigate hot climates. And then it's best to face them north or east away from the prevailing winds, and it's good to have some holes drilled in there for ventilation. So that's how you can attract the owls. But then, what do they do? Well, they eat rodents, and they eat a lot of them. And as you can see from this little video, this young nestling barn owl is choking down an entire adult gopher. This was work done by Laura Chavez. She dissected lots of owl pellets, and we learned that they'll basically eat whatever is the locally available rodents. So in California, in most California agricultural habitats, that's going to be pocket gophers and voles. To a lesser extent, they'll eat deer mice, even house mice sometimes if they're around. And then occasionally, depending on the environment, they'll eat some roof rats. But in vineyards, almost all of their diet is pocket gophers, voles, and to a lesser extent, mice. So all of those things are pests. So that's great. So they're eating the pests. Where do they hunt? We did do some GPS tracking of these birds, putting backpacks on them. This was work done by Geronimo Castañeda and Allison Heisman. And we found that they spend 30 to 40% of their time hunting in the vineyard. But what's available to them is even more vineyard. So what's interesting is that they're spending more time than you would expect, given what's available to them in some of the natural habitats. So they do really like having some of these natural habitats nearby. That's good to attract the owls, and they also will occasionally hunt in there. But the upshot is they're still hunting 30 to 40% of the time in the vineyards. So in terms of offering some concrete recommendations, these two QR codes, and I'll demonstrate with the next slide or two, take you to some maps, interactive maps that we have. These are specifically for Napa. So these, can give you a general idea if you're thinking about other places in the state. But part of our effort in the coming years is to develop similar tools like these, but for other places, namely the Central Valley as well as the Central Coast. But I'm going to briefly highlight what these interactive maps do so they can work on your phone. So the first map tells you where you might want to put your owl boxes. And so you zoom into the map, you could type in your address. So let's say we're working on the Honig Vineyard. We type in that address, and then it shows us the parcel here on the right. And then if you do like a long click with your finger right on the map, then it'll tell you the probability that a nest box will be occupied in that place based on the suite of habitats nearby. And so then this is really what a farmer needs to know. Like, is it worth it for me, right? If the probability of nest box occupancy is somewhere between 37 and 41%, that's pretty high. You put up, 6 or 7 boxes, you're going to get 2 or 3 occupied likely. So that's really helpful. And then in addition, and again, this is specifically for Napa, but we hope to expand this to other regions in the future. For those vineyards that already have nest boxes, we have this other tool to kind of assess, do you have enough? And I'm not going to go through all the details here, but we've got 4 different scenarios where, the cooler colors here suggest places where the owls are not likely to hunt a lot. And the brighter colors suggest places that the owls are likely to hunt. So in this top left panel, that's where we might be obvious. Then we need to be honest and say, oh, in your vineyard, there's so much deep, dark forest nearby, which the barn owls don't really like, that you're unlikely to get a lot of benefit from barn owls. So this isn't a silver bullet. It doesn't work in all places, all times. But then in other places, like this top right, panel B, we can say everything looks amazing. Lots of bright colors, lots of owl boxes. Everything's great. And then I'll just mention this one in the bottom right here, panel D, where we would say, look at all those bright colors. You're likely to get a lot of owl hunting, but you only have 2 boxes. So you're a prime candidate to add more boxes. Okay, so we know they occupy the boxes and what they eat. How much do they eat? Well, this was work done by Dane St. George. We put video cameras inside the nest boxes and we learned that they eat a lot. We estimate that an average family of barn owls eats somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 rodents a year. And that, again, is a mixture of gophers, voles, sometimes mice. So they really are rodent killing machines. So that's a lot of rodents, but of course there's a lot of rodents out there. So is that enough to really matter? We had a couple of students work on this. The first was Ash Hansen. She did work with gophers in particular, and she studied vineyards with and without barn owl boxes. And the vineyards without barn owl boxes, she found that gopher activity, which we measured by seeing how often they would plug up holes that we opened up. So that's a way to assess whether they're there and active. She found that gopher activity increased by 18% over the course of the wine grape growing season. And in the presence of barn owl boxes, gopher activity decreased by 14%. So this is pretty strong empirical evidence that the presence of these occupied barn owl nest boxes decreases gopher activity. So they don't just eat a lot, they eat enough to matter. And then similar work done by Catherine Larson more recently focused on how the barn owls might be affecting voles and mice. We couldn't distinguish voles and mice because we used the technique called chew blocks. So these are little kind of waxy cubes that we put out in the vineyard. The restaurant industry uses these to monitor where rodents are. They're non-toxic. There's just a way you can see how much of these chew blocks have been chewed after a night or two, and that gives you an index of the activity of small above ground rodents like voles and mice. And so we made a gradient of owl hunting pressure from places that had no boxes at all to places with just a few boxes or maybe just boxes occupied by adults to places with lots of boxes and lots of babies where the hunting pressure would be the strongest. And we found that our measure of vole and mice abundance with these chew blocks declined very significantly with this increasing owl hunting pressure. So again, strong evidence suggesting that the owls aren't just eating voles and mice, they're eating enough to meaningfully reduce their abundance. So what does it cost? Well, the investment in a barn owl box is a lot more than a songbird box. They can cost somewhere between maybe $200 and $500, depending on if you make them yourself or if you buy them. I'll give you some more information about that in a moment. But then they'll last a long time too. And so we really wanted to estimate how much these boxes cost per acre per year, as well as per rodent removed per year, since we have those estimates as well. So we developed some economic models to calculate that, and then we wanted to compare that to the cost of another non-toxic method of controlling rodents, and that is trapping. So where we work in Napa Valley, occasionally the rodent populations spike, and some of the vineyard managers actively try to remove those rodents by doing manual trapping with either snap traps, like you see here on the left diagram here, or Maccabee traps, which are used for gophers. And so these traps aren't expensive, but the labor involved with workers to set and retrieve these traps is substantial. So we found when we did our cost estimates that the owl nest boxes over the long run are way less expensive than trapping, like 9 to 10 times less expensive than trapping, largely because of the trapping has that recurring labor cost, whereas the barn owls are just an upfront cost of adding the nest boxes, a little bit of maintenance, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes. But then the owls are doing the work for you, and you don't have to pay the owls other than just giving them a great box to live in. But there's an important caveat to that. And so when we did our modeling to see how much of the rodent population the owls are removing, depending on how much you've invested in owl boxes on a vineyard, for example, we see that, as you would expect, the more that you invest in terms of cost per acre, the more rodents are removed. So this y-axis here is efficacy, which is what the rodent ecologists, that's the word they use for describing what percentage of the rodents have been removed. So if they're removing 100%, obviously that's great. But you can see that the more you invest, the more rodents that you remove. But we have 3 panels here for low, medium, and high rodent abundance. As you probably all know, rodent populations are notoriously dynamic. And so when rodent populations are low to medium, the owls can do quite a bit of work. They can remove, 50, even 100% in some cases, or even at medium density, if you invest enough, they're still removing 60% of the gophers and voles. But at high rodent density, they just can't keep up. They're removing maybe only 25%, even at higher investments. So basically what this means is the owl boxes are really good at maintaining lower numbers of rodents in most years. But when you have an eruption, especially voles, for example, which are notorious for this, you're probably going to need to do something else, like trapping. But hopefully that would be short-lived, and then you can be back to the other numbers. Okay, a few more things about maintenance. So here we're looking in a nest box that's really crowded. You can see these young nestlings are almost crouching. They barely fit inside this nest box. The debris that they're standing on has built up over the years, and they're about ready to fall out. You can see the debris is built up all the way to the entrance hole of this nest box. So another recommendation is it really is important to clean and maintain your nest boxes. So we recommend inspecting them yearly in the non-breeding season, non-breeding for the owls. So that's fall to early winter. Fix normal deterioration. If they're wooden boxes, sometimes they start to swell and, screws come loose or hinges break. Fix those things. And then really avoid those crammed boxes. Clean out the pellet debris if the nest box was used. You can do this pretty simply with a ladder. You should wear an N95 mask because there's a lot of fine dust that comes out of those nest boxes. But we have a new recommendation or a new wrinkle to this. And so we wondered over the years if old nesting debris was good for the owls. Maybe the owls actually like some old nesting debris. And when I say nesting debris, that's a real euphemistic term. Owls, as you might know, don't like bring in sticks or grass or anything like that to make a nest like a songbird might. Instead, they just cough up their pellets, the regurgitated remains of their rodent prey, and kind of stomp on them, and that turns into nesting debris. They also poop in there. Sometimes there's old dead rodents in there. Sometimes there's even old dead chicks in there. So it's a real gross mixture of stuff that we euphemistically call nesting debris. But they might use that nesting debris to indicate or as a signal for what's a good place to nest in. So we did an experiment with 70 boxes that hadn't been used for a couple years. In 35 of them, we added wood chips, which is the typical practice after you clean them out, you replace it with wood chips. And in the other 35, we added nesting debris from other occupied boxes. These boxes in this study hadn't been occupied for a couple years. And then we measured in the following fall, winter, and then the following breeding season if the owls showed a preference. And we did find that they showed a pretty strong preference. So not all nest boxes are created equal. Some nest boxes are better than others, and some nest boxes are in better places than others. So we call that nest box attractiveness. In this case, that's on the x-axis. So the better the box and the better the placement, the more likely it is to be occupied, which is what you see here on the y-axis. But in addition, you see a big difference between the boxes that had nesting debris and the boxes that had wood chips. So for the average attractiveness of a box, the probability of it getting used if it had wood chips was only 10%, and the probability of it getting used if it had old nesting debris was all the way up to 32%. So we are now modifying our recommendations to say, yes, you do need to clean them out because otherwise that stuff will build up and the chicks will be crammed and it's not healthy for them and they might fall out. But when you clean it out, don't clean it out completely and replace it with wood chips. Instead, just leave a small layer left behind, and that will be good to attract owls in the future. So I think we've learned a lot about this system over the years, and we're really excited about our future work. We're now doing a lot of work in the Central Valley of California near Lodi, as well as starting some work in San Luis Obispo area. And we're putting GPS trackers on the birds to understand more and more where they're hunting and exactly what they're eating. So hopefully we'll have a chance to share some of those results as they come out in the coming years. But I wanted to close with this idea, and we're getting close to the holiday season, so maybe this is appropriate to think about giving thanks and being grateful. I think in this situation, the title I think of this webinar has something to do with ecosystem services. That's kind of the scientific ecological term for the services that nature provides that are helpful for people. And that's really important to recognize and quantify and try to understand more thoroughly. But when it comes down to, working on a farm and working with animals, maybe another way of thinking about it is kind of a gift economy. And there's a real reciprocity here to emphasize. And that is that, these birds, the barn owls that I've spoken about, as well as the bluebirds and swallows that Eleanor spoke about, they need these nest boxes. That's where they nest. So you can give them something that they need, and a good, safe nest box that's well maintained can really help support their populations. And then in return, these birds are going to do what they do. They're going to eat the insects in the case of the songbirds, and they're going to eat the rodents in the case of the barn owls. So they're going to give back to you. And I think maybe that's one of the best ways to think about it. And in addition, you'll have this amazing opportunity for those of you that are working in the fields to see these birds, or at least encounter where they live. And they're really amazing creatures. So we're privileged to be able to study them. And I think our farms in the US have really an amazing opportunity to invite them onto their spaces. So with that, I want to thank the funders of this work, which is especially the Agricultural Research Institute, as well as the USDA and the Humboldt Area Foundation. And I think there should be some time for some questions. We have a website that has a bunch of more information that you could check out. It's this link tree. So linktr.ee/barn owls. Here's a QR code to it. Or you can email me, mattjohnson@humboldt.edu. And if you want to follow us on Instagram, there are our tags there. And so with that, I think I'd like to open it up for questions if there are any. Does coating the box with water, sealant, or paint impact owl occupancy? No, we don't think so. We tested that early on, painting the outside, that is. No, I wouldn't do any treatment to the inside, but the outside doesn't seem to affect the occupancy at all, and might, prolong the life of the box, might make it a little bit cooler if you paint it a light color. So yeah, I don't think there's any problem with that. Let's see. Is there any evidence that reduction in mice and gophers reduces competition with ground squirrels? That's a great question. I do not know the answer to that one. I work a lot with Roger Baldwin. He's a vertebrate pest specialist, a rodent specialist at UC Davis. I can extend that question to him. But I will say in general that the relationship between owls and ground squirrels is negligible to only this, via some indirect pathway, because the ground squirrels are almost exclusively diurnal and the barn owls are almost exclusively nocturnal. So even a young ground squirrel, which would be the size available as a prey species for barn owls, is unlikely to be captured by owls. So if there's any interaction, it's going to be indirect, like you say. Do I have opinions about plastic owl boxes? I do. Well, I don't have an opinion. I have evidence. We've looked at that carefully, and the owls show a very strong preference for wooden boxes over plastic ones. With that said, they're not always able to be choosy. So if you're in an area with a lot of owls and they don't have very many nesting sites, you put up the plastic boxes, they're going to get occupied. We have seen high occupancy rate of of plastic boxes in certain places and times. But when there are a lot of boxes available and there are options, the owls almost always select the wooden ones over the plastic ones. The plastic ones will last longer. Um, okay, let's see.
I can throw out a few too if you're
Sure.
willing. So someone says, I know barn owls primarily prey on rodents, but they also prey on birds. How does barn owl presence impact bluebird and barn swallow presence? And, should those two strategies be mutually exclusive?
Yeah, great question. They do occasionally eat birds and very rarely a bat or a small rabbit. But it's about 95+% rodents. So I think there's no overall effect. And I think the few birds that they do eat, they might be roosting at night, but there's sometimes ones they catch in the box themselves. So we've seen them eat a few starlings when the starlings are in the nest box, or a pigeon occasionally. So it does happen, but it's so rare that I really doubt there's any population level effect.
Yeah, I don't know of any studies that show any population level effect on bluebirds or swallows. And then I also put in the chat as well that we've several of the vineyards that we work with have both the barn owl boxes and the bluebird and swallow boxes. Um, and I've seen them nest side by side and both be successful. So yeah, like Matt said, they are overwhelmingly eating rodents. So,
Great, thanks.
I see
I
one
think
here from
but
Aaron.
interesting question.
Yeah, I see
after
one.
Eleanor's presentation, there was a question about where to buy nest boxes, and then we shared some links in the chat, so check those out. I think Eleanor, you recommended the Audubon's model, which you can find at different online retailers. And then, is there any evidence that bluebirds and swallows compete with other birds, specifically finches, which have become a problem in our vineyard?
Yeah, so I put a graphic there from our valley-wide nest box survey where we found that the bluebirds are occupying around 27% of the boxes, the tree swallows occupied around 18% of the boxes. Around half of the boxes that were checked were unoccupied, and then the rest of the boxes were occupied by other species, so house finches, house wrens, which house wrens and also violet green swallows utilize the boxes and are also insectivorous, um, as well as ash-throated flycatchers. In terms of house finches, they're not typically cavity nesting birds, but we would see them opportunistically use the nest boxes occasionally. They are native and so you're not allowed to do anything with their nests. If they're nesting, they're protected. House sparrows, on the other hand, if they are nesting within the vineyard, since they're invasive species, we do recommend removing those nests. There's also other techniques if you don't have the resources or time essentially to continue to monitor the boxes. If you find a house sparrow nesting within them, you can oil the eggs and that will prevent them from hatching. But we do recommend removing those nests if you find them.
Thanks. There was a question about entrance hole guards, which I think has been answered in the chat. But yeah, there's a few different ways that you can try and prevent predators. Entrance hole guards is one. You talked about a few others. Um, so check out that link. And then back to barn owls. Are barn owls territorial like great horned owls?
No, they're not very territorial at all. If if another barn owl lands on their nest box or something like that, they'll chase it away. But otherwise, they're not, and that's one of the great advantages of them as agents of pest control. So if the prey population is high enough, you can get a high density of owls.
Great. What about hantavirus? Is that a concern when cleaning out owl boxes?
It's not a big concern when cleaning out owl boxes. Leptospirosis is maybe a slightly bigger concern, and that's why we recommend the H95 mask. Yeah.
And then is there anything else someone can put besides just leaving a little bit of the debris in the bottom to attract barn
Nope.
owls?
Nope. I think just the debris. I see an interesting comment here from Aaron. Maybe I can elaborate on that one.
Sure.
This is not an uncommon scenario here. So Aaron says, I put up 5 boxes around 31 acres of vineyard on a 200-acre property. It's been about 3 years and only the same one box gets inhabited. Should I move the other boxes to a new location or take some of the debris from the one and spread it around? Also, some are at about 8 feet, and I wonder if they need to be higher up. So I would say a few things there. One, yeah, if they're using that one box and you need to clean it out anyway, definitely put some of that stuff in the other two. That might help. But then in addition, if it's been a few years, and this is my general advice, if it's been a few years and boxes aren't occupied, if they have the means and time, move them to a new location can be a really good idea. And then lastly, we do have evidence that they do like taller poles. So we usually recommend 10 feet at a minimum. So if you do move those boxes, I'd recommend getting them up at least 10, maybe 12 feet high.
Great, thanks. If you have any last questions, please put them in the chat. But I've also shared the link and a QR code for the evaluation form. We encourage everyone to take the evaluation, and we'll be doing a drawing for a Wild Farm Alliance hat. So, next few days, I'll do a random drawing of one person from the people who completed the evaluation to get a hat, and we'll get that mailed to you. If you're looking for credit for either DPR or CCA credit, this is required. And there is a quiz at the end if you're doing DPR credit, looking for DPR credit. So please take the quiz and the evaluation. And then let's see, any last questions? I am not seeing any, so I'll leave this up for a few more minutes so people can grab that link. But thank you so much, Matt and Eleanor, for sharing your research. This is really fascinating. I love seeing new evidence about ways to support our avian friends. So, oh, it looks like we do have one more question. Other than reuse, how do you dispose of the nest box debris? Is composting appropriate?
Yeah, composting would be appropriate. The as long as you get it, buried and covered and get some heat, decomposing that should be great.
Perfect. All right, we are at time. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to our speakers, Matt and Eleanor. We look forward to seeing future research.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.